Hey friends, if you find yourself watching this video, then you are very likely someone who finds themselves drawn to egoist thought. So I want to ask you a question because I'm looking for answers as well. Have you ever felt like every time you try to belong to something, even something that's supposed to empower you, it just ends up flattening you? Like you walk into a space thinking, okay, maybe here I can be myself. And I mean the most radical, the most anarchist, and the most anti-essentialist places you can think of. And then suddenly there's like rules and expectations and language you're supposed to use. And if you step outside of it, if you're too complicated or too contradictory, then you don't belong there either. Do you relate to that? That's kind of what drew me to the person that I want to talk about today, Dora Marsden, because I feel that her life and evolution of thought is exemplary of something like authentic egoism, as stupid as that sounds. Don't get caught up in the language here, it's not that deep. What I mean is, her development, just as the development of so many rejected egoist thinkers, her development seems to kind of be burdened by the various categorizations and group affiliations that people are hurling at her. It seems most of her writing was focused on defying or freeing herself from those burdens. And friends, I don't know about you, but that really hits home for me, you know? Language is so limiting, so trapping, so encasing. And by analyzing these aspects of her, I want to think about those questions. So let's talk about her and then conclude by asking why the very notion of belonging for some people seems to mean disappearing. So let's first talk about her life. Dora Marsden was born in 1882 in Yorkshire to working class parents. After her father immigrated to the US due to financial hardship, her mother kind of supported the family as a seamstress, and they grew up in poverty. But Marsden was a very sharp person. She got to attend school thanks to new education laws, became a tutor at 13, and eventually earned a Queen's Scholarship to study at Owens College in Manchester. She graduated in 1903 and became a teacher and later a headmistress. But Marsden didn't stay in that respectable lane for very long. So in 1909, she was actually arrested for interrupting a university speech dressed in full academic robes, demanding justice for suffragettes being force-fed in prison. And that same year, she climbed a theater and waited for 15 hours just to heckle Winston Churchill. So her kind of fire earned her a spot in the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, which was led by the Pankhursts. But she also clashed with their leadership, so she was a little bit too independent, too theoretically driven. By 1911, she then left and was determined to create a space for more radical and varied voices. At some point, she decided to turn to publishing, and she founded and edited a series of increasingly radical journals, which marked a new beginning for a fascinating development which aligns with her own egoist radicalization, in my opinion. So the publications were The Free Woman from 1911, The New Free Woman from 1913, and then The Egoist, which ran from 1914 to 1919. These magazines are interesting because they also became platforms for avant-garde literature and philosophy, and actually helped launch the careers of various writers like Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and T.S. Eliot, just to name a few big names. But more than just that, they also served as Marsden's vehicle for a pioneering form of egoism, which she expressed in her own work. I would say that Marsden's intellectual contributions were bold and far ahead of her time. But obviously they were also isolating. And just as with so many of the egoist thinkers we all know and love, toward the later years of her life, she is said to have struggled with mental health and lived in increasing obscurity. So she spent the later part of her life in psychiatric care and died in 1960, largely forgotten by the literary and political movements she had once challenged so fiercely. But before we get into why it happened that way and what could have led to the rejection of Dora Marsden's work and influence from discourse, let's look into her editorial work. So, Dora Marsden's most influential contributions were not in the form of standalone books, but through her editorial work and philosophical essays that were published in the journals that she founded. These periodicals were pretty groundbreaking platforms that combined feminist literary and philosophical content in ways that were entirely unprecedented at the time. So first we have The Free Woman, which ran from 1911 to 1912. This journal kind of marked Marsden's break with mainstream suffrage feminism. So in this journal, she critiqued the movement's moralism, puritanism, and emphasis on equality. And she very much advocated for sexual freedom, economic independence, and a rethinking of women's roles beyond moral duty or political utility. The journal was shocking both to the conservative public but also to liberal feminists for its very unapologetic discussions of topics like marriage, prostitution, and free love. And it also marked her early steps toward egoism and more individualist thought. Then came The New Free Woman, which was started in 1913. This is a very short-lived but also very transformative journal. When you analyze her work, it kind of makes sense and you can see that development because it very much signaled her turn from feminist politics to philosophy and literary modernism. With help from Ezra Pound, who was like co-literary editor, I believe, The New Free Woman most definitely became a vehicle for publishing avant-garde writers and for deepening her own exploration of individualism. Something that did happen during this time is that her own work kind of grew increasingly abstract and metaphysical, which turned off various previous readers. And this is kind of when she took a radical stance against the idea of women's liberation, which she saw as just another constraint if it served a collective identity. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have The Egoist, which was started in 1914 and ran all the way up until 1919. This publication is widely considered her most influential editorial endeavor because The Egoist kind of solidified Marsden's philosophical stance as an egoist, which is obviously inspired by Max Jenna's The Ego in Its Own, but she's also very much inspired by philosophers like Nietzsche. So in the journal, Marsden published, I would say, more dense and provocative essays, which were largely on the nature of selfhood, value, and authority, so there was less of a feminist angle to them. Also, she developed a very distinct brand of egoism that rejected all external sources of meaning whatsoever in her very own style and philosophical voice. So this very much marked like a shift or a development in her method as well, which again alienated previous readers. But even in those 5 years of editing and writing for The Egoist, her work was extremely defiant of any and all labels that people were trying to apply to her thought. So even the idea of being quote-unquote an egoist was something that Marsden would ultimately reject, which of course makes total sense, but did rub some people the wrong way and alienated further readership, which was already previously alienated by her turn from feminism towards egoism. Even though Marsden's own philosophical writings in the journal had been largely forgotten up until recently, they are now being revisited as early expressions of radical individualist philosophy, so that's an interesting new development. So I would like to now have a look at her own writing, her own essays, her own work. So first let's talk about one of her early works. Just to kind of see the development, I'm going to take like a chronological approach. So there's a text called Bondwomen from December 28th, 1911. In Bondwomen, she contrasts free women with bondwomen by examining the spiritual and social subjugation of women throughout history. So basically, she says that bondwomen are not true individuals and that they define themselves through their roles as complements to men. like wives, mothers, helpers, and supporters. And she claims that this condition is not the result of mere oppression, but also of women's internalization of a servile mindset that is shaped by centuries of adaptation to dependency, sacrifice, and moral subordination. So basically, Marsden challenges the notion that women can or should be labeled free when the vast majority have never lived or thought independently. She argues that women's intelligence and judgment have been long held in contempt, not from malice, but from observable history. So women have rarely formed their own ideals or claimed the master's role in society, which means that their virtues like dutifulness, sacrifice, or morality are traits of a servant class. And even in love or sexuality, women kind of defer to male standards. So what she does here is she interrogates the roots of this dynamic, and she suggests it could stem from women's childbearing roles or a bargain made for protection and companionship at the cost of independence. And the comforts of protection, ease, and social flattery have kind of sedated women into accepting a position that denies them public achievement and power. So as men grow less reliant on women's domestic utility now, women face a crossroad. They either remain passive dependents or they strive to become masters, like creators, thinkers, and independent agents. She also insists, as part of her conclusion, that freedom is a kind of awakening that can't be granted by others, and that only those who develop and assert their own values, so those who reject the role of the comforter and the protected, can actually be free. So then, feminism, in her opinion, is not just about equality, but about cultivating individual mastery and abandoning the inherited morality of self-sacrifice. So this kind of moved feminism from a collective cause to an individual liberation, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time. The next text I want to discuss is from her Views and Comments series in The New Free Woman, which was a recurring editorial column where Marsden kind of sharpened her metaphysical and philosophical voice. So here she begins rejecting feminism's collective ideals altogether and kind of moves closer to Ashtana-like egoism. Like she writes, for example, that the cause is the last refuge of the morally enslaved and calls for an ethic grounded in self-assertion rather than duty. So one of the texts I found most interesting here is her text on property, which kind of shows a first move toward the more metaphysical aspects of individualism, I would say. So basically in this text, she argues that debates about property are kind of muddled by moral judgments, which includes the notion that property is quote-unquote good or bad. So she feels that the debates are not really focused on what property actually is. So then she goes into what she thinks property is, which she feels is the more important and needed analysis here. So according to her, property is simply what is one's own, so defined by one's ability to control or act upon it. So this makes collective ownership a facade. And in reality, control always ends up in the hands of a few powerful individuals, which renders property effectively private again. So basically, she contends that ownership is inseparable from individuality and willpower, and that property encompasses not just material goods, but one's inherent traits, like instincts, beauty, intelligence, and so forth, which form the basis for acquiring external possessions. And this makes property fluid and dynamic, and naturally gravitating towards those with the strongest will, regardless of legal or moral frameworks. She also claims that attempts to stabilize or redistribute property through authority or morality are actually futile, because according to her, respecting others' property is a concern for the weak. So this is a very, extremely radically egoist stance. Ultimately, Marsden kind of champions egoistic ownership by arguing that property is an expression of selfhood and that moral or collective claims are often just tools of control or excuses for powerlessness. And this is clearly an individualistic and also anarchist position, which is later developed into a more uniquely egoist approach. So this starts to happen around a year later when she first published the journal, The Egoist. And here I want to briefly look at a text which shows another evolution in her thought that I see, which critiques the newest movement she became associated with. So here we have the text, The Illusion of Anarchism. So in this text, Marsden offers a very sharp critique of anarchism, which argues that anarchists, despite their revolutionary image, are essentially spiritual heirs of Christianity and humanitarianism. This is obviously a very critical and very radical stance. She claims that anarchists idealize humanity while also harboring deep aversion to actual people and human behavior. She also asserts that every person is born an what she calls archist, which is a being naturally driven to assert and expand their own interests. Whereas anarchism teaches that people ought to suppress these natural instincts in favor of abstract moral principles like conscience and the rights of man. And she sees this moralizing impulse as religious in nature, so kind of a secularized continuation of Christian renunciation. Then she criticizes anarchists for believing that individual liberty can be made inviolable in a world driven by competing and aggressive interests. So she views anarchism as an idealistic but naive creed, so one that denies the basic biological and social truths of life, which is that all beings fight to assert their interests and that growth itself is inherently aggressive. She also takes aim at public opinion by describing it as the collective self-interest of non-combatants who are initially defensive and resistant to change, but ultimately malleable. She also argues here that public opinion supports the status quo until it sees which side is likely to win, and then it shifts allegiance to the victor, which kind of retrospectively justifies their cause. So then the thing that determines legitimacy in the public eye is actually success and not morality. So in essence, she critiques anarchism as an unrealistic, moralistic doctrine that misrepresents the nature of human beings and social power, and she portrays public opinion as opportunistic and devoid of principle. It should also be mentioned that Marsden's philosophy later very much shifted to a new direction, which I would kind of classify as mystical egoist cosmology. So basically later in her career, she started to blend her radical feminism turned individualist anarchism turned egoism with a more like mystical and metaphysical framework. So her philosophy evolved into something less political and more personal, which is actually a very egoist approach. In this later phase, her writing reflects a deeper exploration of her very own self or ego as the central force in existence. And she begins to kind of argue that the individual had to not only reject societal expectations and collective ideologies, but also has to transcend all forms of external influence to fully embrace their own inherent power. And at this point, she was pretty much straight up ignored. Okay, so what do we see here? What's the pattern? I would say that Dora Marsden's work represents a very unique and deeply and continuously evolving perspective, which kind of happened alongside the alienation of her audience. So she began critiquing the subjugation of women, then she moved toward a more radical form of individualism inspired by anarchism, and ultimately developed a kind of mystical and metaphysical vision of selfhood, which I feel went over people's heads. So her consistent act of despookification of all aspects which could potentially spook her within the affiliated philosophy, which ended in a deeply, almost too personal approach to her expression and thought, kind of ended her in obscurity. So it was so personal and so unspooked that people could no longer use it to belong in any sense. But let's think on all the reasons why she was rejected from discourse. The first reason, in my opinion, is her ideological incompatibility with mainstream feminism. That's how it started, at least. So Marsden's transition from suffragist to egoist was extremely radical and extremely alienating. So she harshly criticized mainstream feminist movements for their moralism and collectivism and fixation on equality. And instead of advocating for solidarity or shared political identity, which is what people thought was going to get the movement further in its desired direction, she insisted on a kind of radical individual sovereignty that was very much rooted in Shinna's egoism, where even the category of woman was a spook. And this made her very unpalatable to both early feminists and later second-wave feminists who were invested in structural critiques and collective empowerment. So her disdain for group identity and resistance to moral frameworks, which was her very authentic approach, set her firmly outside feminist canons for decades. Then we have the issue with her writing style development. So her later writings are when you can see it really well, especially after The Egoist. So these are very dense and abstract and highly metaphysical writings. So she drew on Sterne and Nietzsche and even mystical traditions and produced texts that challenged conventional syntax even and traditional philosophical categorization. And this made her work very inaccessible to wider audiences and very hard to anthologize. And compared to other feminist writers or anarchist writers of her era, her voice, I think, in the public eye lacked the clarity and rhetorical appeals that made others more popular and more influential. Then we also have to, of course, acknowledge her marginal position in literary and political history, right? So although she published early work by Ezra Pound and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, she herself was very much sidelined in literary history. That's obviously because she was not part of the modernist male authors that she helped promote. So her own philosophical and editorial work was dismissed as, eccentric or irrelevant or too radical or too out there in general. And people like Ezra Pound and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot were celebrated for their contributions to the literary canon. She also refused to tether herself to any political party or movement or ideology, which, left her without an institutional base of support, which is probably why she largely had to produce her own publication. Then we have to consider her withdrawal from public life, which was likely brought on by disillusionment, honestly, and was then called schizophrenia, as so many other things were called back in the day, but that is just my opinion. So basically, Marsden's later life was marked by isolation, right? So after publishing her major philosophical treatise, The Definition of the Godhead, in 1928, which was a very ambitious work that was ultimately ignored, she kind of withdrew from intellectual circles. And at this point, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent the final decades of her life in asylums. This kind of tragic decline obviously further erased her presence from the cultural memory and made her less likely to be taken seriously by later scholars. I would like to leave you here with the thought that maybe, just maybe, not everything that goes over the heads of the collective is schizophrenia. But what do I know? Lastly, I would say that her thought was simply too ahead of its time and too extreme for spooked minds. And what I mean by that is that Marsden's radical individualism very much anticipated many of the insights of postmodern feminism, post-structuralism, queer theory, and critiques of identity politics, but she simply arrived too early, in my opinion. So her rejection of all forms of idealism and moral authority and social identity was simply too extreme for her contemporaries and did not fit into the ideological paradigms that came later. It's actually only now in the 21st century that there is a slow resurgence of interest in her as a philosopher of liberation beyond identity. But I would say that even now, people are hardly ready for this kind of philosophy.